folks. We are fortunate that we're going to get to hear from Renata Brillinger about the latest in incentives and policy that relates to soil health in our area. Renata Brillinger is the co-founder and executive director of the California Climate and Agricultural Network, which is known as CalCAN. CalCAN is a statewide coalition that advances state and federal policy to bring farmer and rancher voices into the climate policy arena, advocating for research, incentives, and technical assistance for growers to implement practices with climate benefits. Thank you, Renata.
Thanks, Keith. You saved me my introduction about what CalCAN is. Appreciate that. We can get right into the details of the policy world, which hopefully relate to some of what you're hearing in this webinar, because what's happening in California is a number of incentives programs have started up in the last few years that that provide grants for farmers of all kinds and all scales and for various practices that have climate benefits. So that's, the state has come to call that approach climate smart agriculture. So that's what I'm going to cover in just a few minutes, and happy to answer questions now or later. So as Keith said, we're a coalition of sustainable and organic ag organizations. We've been together 11 years now, really bringing farmer and rancher voices into the policy space to look for various incentives and removal of barriers to practicing these farming practices that have not only climate benefits, reducing emissions, sequestering carbon, but also a whole bunch of other environmental and health co-benefits. So that's our work. California is really leading the world, I would say. They're not alone, but they're among the top leaders in the world in terms of addressing climate change through policy, and have established some of the most ambitious goals for greenhouse gas reductions. So by the year 2045, the intent is to get to net carbon neutrality economy-wide. And in our opinion, and in the opinion of many scientists, this is only going to be possible if we increase the amount of carbon that's sequestered in soil and plants and reduce emissions overall in the sector. And there's a lot of ways that that can be done. Reducing energy and fuel use for all of the reasons agriculture needs to use energy and fuel, reducing nitrogen fertilizer use, producing renewable energy on farms, just conserving farmland from urban sprawl avoids future emissions increases, reducing methane emissions from livestock, and storing carbon in soil and plants. And so, recognizing these opportunities, the state has stood up a number of grants programs in the last 5 years, I guess we are into it now, sort of sequenced in, and I'm going to just really briefly describe 4 that we track and have prioritized as some of the most powerful strategies. And then I'm going to hone in on the Healthy Soils program and briefly touch on the water conservation program. So to date, in all 4 of the programs I'm about to describe, there's been over $400 million either spent or budgeted to get into the hands of farmers, get into the pockets of farmers and ranchers to do these practices. It's an extraordinary investment. Not nearly where we need to be to address the climate crisis, but we're making a dent. So one of the programs is the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, or SALC. This is the world of acronyms, just so you know. We're in government land here. So SALC is a grants program that funds permanent protection of farmland and rangeland, so as to prevent urban sprawl and urban development, intensified development. Another program I won't talk about much at all, but is important here in the North Coast, is the AMP program, Alternative Manure Management Program. And this program gives grants to farmers to modernize their manure management equipment and thereby reduce methane emissions that come off of the manure lagoons and those anaerobic conditions that the methane bacteria live in. It dries out the manure and encourages farmers to compost it and use it on their crop fields, which has tremendous climate benefits, as well as a lot of benefits to the ranch, to the dairy producer. So the 2 programs I'll spend the most time on are the Healthy Soils program and the SWEEP program, or the State Water Efficiency and Enhancement Program. The Healthy Soils program, the objective of this program is to build soil carbon, soil organic matter, and reduce emissions. And the 4 basic principles of all the practices that are eligible for funding under the program are to keep the soil covered, to minimize disturbance with reduced or no-till, and to maximize diversity and plant life. There are 25 practices that are currently eligible for funding, and I encourage all of you to take a look at them. There's a grant period open right now that I'll talk about just at the end here, with quite a lot of money available, so your chances of getting funded between now and June is the application window. The chances are high that you'll get a grant, because we're not sure about how the demand is going to be for the $28 million, excuse me, $25 million that's available. But the practices are many. Composting, cover cropping, reduced or no-till. These all have to be things that you are not currently doing on a given lot or block. Various ways to reduce fertilizer inputs, and then a whole suite of practices that increase diversity, like with hedgerows, riparian restoration, that kind of thing. To date, this program has funded almost $18 million worth of projects in over 300 projects around the state, 24 of which are in Sonoma County. And you can see how many tons of greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced, about 8,400 cars per year worth. And then the SWEET program I want to mention, because it's an underutilized program here in Sonoma County. Various grants for various practices that reduce water use and thereby reduce energy use. That's the climate connection. If we can reduce energy, then we're reducing CO2 emissions. And this program will fund things like soil moisture monitoring, weather stations, improved irrigation equipment, solar pumps, pump improvements of various kinds, all of which would lead to reduced use of energy and water. And as we're looking at another dry year, this might be a good time to look at it. There's no grant period open right now, but we expect one later in the year. To date, it's been very, very popular, the most popular of the programs that are offered in California, $72 million to more than 700 projects, and not very many in the county, as I said, and has reduced emissions, 16,000 cars a year worth of emissions. Really briefly want to talk about an important new addition to the grants that are available in the state, which is these technical assistance grants. This was a bill that CalCan sponsored in 2018 that passed and has since been implemented to take a portion of the budgets of those programs I just briefly talked about and allocate them. 5% of those budgets get allocated for grants to technical assistance providers to assist farmers with applying. And this is really important. It's a sort of cradle to grave service, helping growers identify the projects that will fit the grant criteria, doing the applications, which are unfortunately not super straightforward, getting better, but still time consuming and sometimes intimidating. And then implementing the projects that get funded, and then monitoring and reporting on them. So it's a whole set of support that's available. There's $2 million that was awarded just in the fall to, I think, 33 RCDs and nonprofits. About half of those were RCD, resource conservation districts around the state. Did Sonoma RCD get one? Do you know?
Which, I'm sorry.
A technical assistance grant? We're not too sure. No. Gold Ridge got one, so. Yeah, and there's also I believe there's a UC Cooperative Extension staff person up in Mendocino. Oh, it's you, Glenn, or your office. That's another resource available to help growers with their applications and their implementation. This is a really critical piece of the puzzle, so that it facilitates their participation. This is a quick scan of the progress of financial progress made on these various programs. You can see from this chart how they've been phased in over time. The Healthy Soils program, the SWEET program. SWEET was one of the earliest programs. Healthy Soils has been online now for just 3 years. And you can see how the money available fluctuates. That's a product of the vagaries of the legislative process and the governor's interest and appreciation of the programs. And this is a role of CalCan's, is to continue to be the squeaky wheel on behalf of agriculture to make sure that there's sufficient funding in these programs to meet the demand. We have a hard row ahead because the governor's proposal, you can see in the last column there for healthy soils, he's proposing we cut it almost in half compared to the year we're currently in. He's happily proposed an increase in the SWEET program. So it just requires, there's a lot of demand for this money, and it just requires a steady presence, a steady voice in the Capitol. And that's something we ask for grower support in doing, in the form, very simple ways to do that, just signing on to letters, making calls periodically, sometimes coming to the Capitol for visits, or to the offices of district legislators. So if you're interested in any of that kind of advocacy work, we'd really welcome your participation. So the last thing I want to just touch on is to urge people to take a look at the Healthy Soils grant application. The grant period just opened a couple weeks ago. There's $25 million available. There's a number of improvements to the program. If you looked at it before and you were disinclined to apply for a lot of reasons, take another look. It's been greatly streamlined. There's a rolling application period, so there's a wider window. The grants get accepted as they get reviewed as they come in. So you're not waiting. The money maybe could run out, so I wouldn't delay too long. I wouldn't push it right to the 26th of June, but just take a look at those practices. Some new practices have been added as well. And if you're interested, you can see the link here for technical assistance providers that will take you to a page where there's contact information for those folks. And then you can learn more about the Healthy Soils program on our website. The HSP, the one that ends with HSP. Stay tuned on the SWEEP applications. And then as I said, if you want to get involved with CalCan and advocate with us at the state level, or just learn more about these programs, the contact information is there for our website and how to sign up for our newsletter. And there's my personal contact information. I'm happy to answer questions that way as well.
There's just one question. They're wondering what the factors are that lead to the reduction in funding for the Healthy Soils program, given there's so much interest in it.
Yeah, this is a bit of a mystery. We have a new governor. He's only been a year in office. Last year he said Healthy Soils were a passion of his. In a budget hearing, a budget press release, and then followed with a proposal for $28 million in funding. This year, no mention of Healthy Soils and a cut, almost back to where we were 2 years ago. So we don't really understand exactly where the governor's at with regard to this. The legislature is mixed. There are some good champions, including Senator McGuire and Assemblymember Wood, our representatives here, Assemblymember Levine as well. There's a lot of things those people are paying attention to, and I think we just need to make more noise, especially coming straight from farmers about why these are important, all the multiple benefits they provide, how they'll help growers stay in business and deal with climate chaos. That a lot of those practices also have climate benefits in the form of being more resilient. So we have a farmer letter right now that we're actively looking for signatures on to bring to the legislature to encourage them to propose higher levels than the governor's budget. So there's just a lot of competing priorities, I think, in short.
Well, thank you, Renata.
Thank you very much for having me.
And then just bear with us, everybody who's watching. We just need a few minutes. Keith is going to introduce the panel, and the screen is going to show our panelists as we kind of get set up in the studio.
Yeah, and I just want to mention before we get going with the panel, first, thank you very much, Renata. That was a great and succinct discussion on what's going on. She mentioned technical assistance providers, though we didn't get that grant. I mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, we have a grant that allows us to come out and do a technical assistance site visit to talk about any kind of soil health practice or anything that could have a potential carbon sequestration benefit. And we are happy to do that. And we encourage those who are viewing to contact our office, and myself or Agnes or Wojtav or possibly someone else can help and come out and talk to you about that. We're looking into how we might be able to use that funding to help with applications. But I think first thing first is we can come out, look at your farm and talk about what might apply and might be worth pursuing. And with that,
there are field days too, right? Happening maybe not here, but there are field days around the state too, if people want to learn that way about what's
Yeah,
available.
if you look at the Healthy Soils website, they have information, the CDFA Healthy Soils. If you type that into Google, it will alert you to a few statewide
Trainings and
trainings
workshops
and
yeah.
whatnot. You can learn more about the program. And as Renata said, it has improved. It was more restricted before. It's improving in terms of what people can do and whether they've done it or not before. So I encourage you to research that. And with that, we're going to take a couple minutes to set up the panel.
If I could just say one thing, there's also Fish Friendly Farming, who a lot of our growers are participating in. They are a technical service provider through the Healthy Soils program, and they have a workshop at our office, the wine grower office, in April regarding that. So if anyone is interested, just email kate@sonomawinegrape.org, and I can give you that information. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to have the panel now, which is always a fun and exciting part of our get-togethers. We have some really good folks here today. You've heard from two of them so far. So I'm going to introduce the next two people, and they're going to speak first just for a couple minutes and share some overarching thoughts about soil health and their perspective or experience. And then we have some targeted questions we're going to ask them. And then the last 10, 15 minutes, after about a half an hour, we're going to give them, we'll have another 10 minutes or so for the question and answers that are coming through the internet lines. So with that, we have at the end of the table, we have Brian Rahn. He has been a certified professional soil scientist and agronomist and a certified crop advisor for over 30 years. Mr. Rahn founded Coastal Viticultural Consultants Incorporated, CVC, in 1997 and provides agricultural consulting for thousands of acres of premium vineyards throughout California, Oregon, and internationally. He is an industry leader in soil mapping, grape and wine quality enhancement, vineyard irrigation, wine grape nutrition, and vineyard design. Next to him, we have Glen Mcgorry. He is the wine growing and plant science advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension Offices in Lake and Mendocino County. He received an AB degree in botany from Humboldt State University in 1974. He received an MS degree in plant, soil, and water science from the University of Nevada, Reno in 1979. Glen joined the UC Cooperative Extension in 1987 and works with wine grape growers, wineries, nurseries, landscapers, and vegetable growers. And I would like to add that Glen has been an incredible resource to our agricultural community for years. I met him over 20 years ago when we worked on some events together long before I was at the RCD, and he is retiring, sadly, but happily, I suppose, too. In this summer, and I just want to thank you for all you've contributed. I suspect you're not going away. So thank you for all you've done, and you enjoy every bit of the retirement you've earned. And with that, if you want to share a couple words, not about your retirement, but about soil health or whatever you like, and then we'll hear from Brian for a couple minutes.
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really honored to be here in Sonoma County. And it's, having this group together is also special because you've got a lot of knowledge sitting here at this table. So I've been working with soil health on one level or another since about 1988 when we created the mother of all cover crop trials, and we had 32 different species and cultivars planted. Up to that point, the way that people manage soils was pretty much whipping and fluffing them and making everything look tidy. And we've moved away from that happily. And what we're seeing, of course, is that there's a lot of changes. It's been really fun listening to people talk today. I think ranging from Patty's Oregon experiences where you have actually really quite good soils to Sonoma County where some of the soils were shallow. And I think the thing that came through loud and clear is very site specific in terms of what kind of a plan you put together. And you have people like Brian to help you. And then getting measurements and what's actually going on is difficult, but I think very important to look at change over time. As I think about soil health, what I think about is creating these vineyards that are resilient, that can take drought, but also can take inundation. So because occasionally that's how the North Coast is. Last year we had a lot of rain. This year we don't seem to be getting much. And you want to make your vineyard be able to cruise through either situation, either scenario as best you can. So I think that in order to do that, less tillage is better. And I would actually like to see vineyards go to complete no-till if possible. The problem with that is, of course, is that we don't quite know how to do that in all situations. But I'm coming to the conclusion the way that I'm starting to manage my vineyard now is by having sheep come in this time of the year. And we bring in large numbers for short periods of time. I have 8 acres. We bring in 450 sheep, and they will get through that 8 acres in about a day and a half, and we leave it looking like a golf course. And that's a really great place to start. And then I don't have the equipment now. I'm going under the vine tillage. Basically, Roundup doesn't work anymore in our neighborhoods because there's resistant weeds all over the place. So the Roundup only program won't work. So that's not an option for us. So I'm beginning to think that probably having tillage under the vines would be the first step, and then go to mowing. So eventually we have no till whatsoever. We don't quite have the equipment in place yet, so we need to actually develop some of that to make it work better. But what that allows is by having total covers that you get very great infiltration rates, up to 200% greater infiltration compared to tillage. And then increasing organic matter is mentioned early on about how with each percent you're storing another 20,000 gallons of available water to the vine. So I think that's really smart too. And then finally, you're getting the microbes and the microbiome sort of harnessed up, which has all kinds of implications for root health, which we don't even understand yet, but I think that's an area that needs to be looked at. The other thing that we need to take a look at, which we haven't so far, is kind of greenhouse gas fluxes in the root system. We're taking a look at nitrous oxide production, which actually makes things worse. So we've got to figure out how to minimize nitrous oxide. We don't really understand how nitrous oxide behaves in a natural ecosystem, but that's for the young ones to take a look at, because I'm bowing out. But the next generation of scientists working with this, I hope that they take a good look at that so we can understand that sometimes you could do damage by putting too much organic matter on at the wrong time and working it in. So I see there's lots more left to do. We scratched the surface, and I'm hoping that the next generation will do more. Thank you.
All right, do I need to use this mic here? Yeah, okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. I am a soil scientist, so this great interest in soil health is music to our ears. A soil scientist, because typically we're a small group talking amongst each other with not very much interest from the general public. So the fact that soil health is a thing is great. I'll be brief. Manage and measure soil organic matter, which is really soil carbon. The more biomass you put into your system, the more organic matter you get, and it will eventually get in the soil. Reduce soil erosion. The topsoil that you build, keep it in place, and design the vineyards with enough vigor in the rootstocks to be able to take the competition from a cover crop, which are essentially planted weeds. So I think we need to look at which rootstocks we plant in which soils to allow for this pressure that we get from the cover crops to be able to go to a no-till or complete cover type of system.
Great. I don't need a different one. Okay, great. We're going to start. That was great. Thank you, both of you. I'm going to start with some general questions on organic matter, and then we can just, we'll start with Mark and go down the line. You can take a minute or two to answer, and if you want to pass, you can take that option too. First, what is the ideal range of organic matter content you like to see in the soil, and why? Mark?
Do I need my microphone?
I think you're okay, Mark.
Okay. I'm not going to pass. It'd be ridiculous. I like to see about 2 to 3%. I think less than 2%. It's really about the mineralization of nitrogen primarily. There's a lot more to it than just that, but too much organic matter could lead to too much nitrogen availability for the vine, which could overstimulate the growth of the vine, especially in a wet climate like we have here. It's probably going to be different in a drier climate. It probably could go higher. I'd say you could go higher in a more arid climate than the North Coast or, of course, Oregon. But yeah, I think 2 or 3%. If I see under 2%, I like to try to get it higher. If I see over 3, then we don't usually try to back off the inputs, compost, and try to back out. You may even use different cover crops that are less likely to increase the organic matter. But rarely we see numbers that high anyway. We're mostly down to the 2%.
Patty, would you like to add anything?
I think Mark covered it well. I mean, we're not used to seeing anything below 2% in
Right.
at least those soils we're working on. So we're
Right.
usually on the higher end, which does lead to bigger issues that, you know, if you have the ability to control it, you know, which we don't necessarily because of our rainfall and just the natural soils.
Sure. Glenn, I know you have an answer.
Sure. So it's going to depend somewhat on soil texture, and the sandier, the more difficult it is to accumulate organic matter. But building it into that 2% range in sand would be good. Our years of growing grapevines organically in Mendocino County, we sort of like going as high as 5% on a lot of our vineyards, because what we like about that is as we get to those higher percentages, then we find we're having to irrigate less, which is always a benefit. And again, we're working on resilience, so we really like the idea of having a vineyard that doesn't need much irrigation, but still can take an inundation. It helps with the soil structure when you have more organic matter in it, and it helps with aggregation. So we'll shoot for a little higher maybe than what you're used to. I also want to bring up the mysterious subject of biochar. And, you know, so far biochar has been an underachiever, but when I was in Italy this last summer, I saw some really interesting things. And biochar, if you don't know it, has been pyrolyzed wood products, and they're extremely stable in the soil. They may last up to 400 years. And since we have a timber industry and we have a lot of waste stream, it's a possibility for us to use it. But what I would caution everyone on is you don't want to get into a situation where you're putting more energy into creating the biochar than, and in other words, you're having a net release of carbon dioxide to create it. But I saw some really interesting stuff in Italy on where they're generating energy by creating biogas through pyrolysis, which is instead of burning things at 1,000 degrees centigrade, you burn it about 300 or 400. And the gases that come off then run internal combustion engines, and they generate electricity to run wineries, and plus they're taking out forest thinnings and making biochar in the process. So I was very excited about that, because right now biochar has not performed the way that we hoped. And I think there could be a future in that here in the North Coast, where we do have timber and wood waste.
All great comments. I agree that there's a variation in what's an acceptable organic matter range, and that is definitely soil driven. When we design our vineyards now, it's by soil units. So you have to evaluate that particular soil series, soil type, figure out what the acceptable range or the achievable range is in that particular soil, and develop those numbers. Certainly 2 to 3 is common and is achievable. 5 would be commendable in some of these soils. But in general, it's each unit you want to investigate and figure out what works there.
Great. And I've got a note that you should use the mic too, because people couldn't hear everything. A related question, how often do you think it is good to test your organic matter content, and what other associated soil health tests might you want to conduct regularly? Mark?
You start? Okay. You know, I don't think it's necessary to do it very often. I'd say every 3 to 5 years, somewhere in there. You're not going to change it that quickly, no matter what you do. It's really difficult to get a percent increase in soil organic matter in just a couple of years. Compost, if you think about it, really, even at the rates we put on, can only do a tiny fraction of the amount we want. Cover crops do a really good job, and no-till, of course, does a really good job to preserve that. So I'd say every 3 to 5 years is probably sufficient. There's no really great need to do it any more than that. I guess 3 years is a great number, but you know, we're usually sampling for other things as well, soil chemistry, pH, and those kind of things also. But that's probably typical 3 years, but I think 5 years is allowable as well.
Excellent. Patty?
So I agree with that. We had looked at our longer term study with the young vineyard, and we thought we were going to be able to move the dial because we were putting a lot of biomass on. We didn't move it at all. So that was looking at it within the beginning year and then the end year of the project. And that was 4 years, and there was no difference. We already had a high soil organic matter, and we wouldn't, and in hindsight, we realized that it was good to measure, but we didn't expect that it would have changed that much. And right now, our best recommendations just in general for soil, looking at soil nutrients is about every 3 years, not necessary to do every year, and you might as well just look at organic matter whenever you get that done. So it's more, from a nutrient standpoint, you might be able to change that a little bit more in that time frame than be able to change the organic matter.
Probably more important to look at to ensure that you're not depleting organic matter than anything else.
Good point.
Yeah, so I agree with the other two panelists, but of course I'm watching the grapevines really closely too to see what they're doing. That's probably more important to me, is to follow kind of the, what our pruning weights are, what our yields are, and also what's going on with the petiole nutrient analysis. So, and that's pretty much the normal course of how vineyards are monitored, is that we're looking at annual petiole analysis and then looking at soils every 3 to 5 years, and that's probably adequate.
I would ditto that as well. The question was other things to look at besides organic matter. Might be, depth of topsoil. I think that's something that's missing. May not change an awful lot in percentage, but we might be developing more topsoil deeper. I think that's an aspect of soil health we should look at. That and just that tilth, porosity, compaction, bulk density type of thing.
Excellent.
I did want to add one other thing I forgot about too, which is starting to assess microbiomes. We don't really know how to do that completely yet. We're getting a lot of interesting data. With the improvement in genomics, we're starting to be able to look at classes of organisms in the soil, and you do make significant changes as you add organic matter, and that has implications for vine health. But we don't quite know yet how to read the data. It's more work for the young'uns to take care of.
Josh? So, great answers. Thank you. Here's some tillage questions. And some good ones. If you're using a no-till approach, how do you incorporate cover crops, compost, amendments? How does the general soil health program differ with no-till versus alternate or full-till management?
Who do you want to start with?
You.
I always have to start. Okay.
Next time we'll do it.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. How does it? Well, there's some amendments you can apply that don't need to be tilled in. I'd say we're doing a lot of gypsum, and gypsum will move through the profile, not quickly but slowly through the profile, but it will move. Lime doesn't go anywhere. Compost is actually okay to leave on the surface. Ideally, a light incorporation would help, but we don't want it to break down really quickly. So that said, I think there's no such thing as a completely no-till vineyard. As much as I'd like it to be, and I think everybody here would probably agree with me, we have to till occasionally. And so sometimes we'll use if we have to put amendments down and we're trying not to till, we'll have to go through with a ripping shank, type like a yeoman's plow or a wing tine ripper, just down 18 inches, 2 feet, near the vines every other row, and then we'll incorporate amendments if we have to. We're not tilling the entire middle, but we're tilling at least a couple strips down the middle to try to get some of those amendments down. But there is a compromise. You always have to compromise.
Sure. Excellent. Anything to add?
So my biggest thing is I agree 100% that a no-till doesn't mean for eternity. That's what I'm always faced with in talking to growers, is that, they think they have to design something, build a platform or foundation of their vineyard floor, and that they're never going to touch it again. And that's just not possible. I mean, you get weed shifts. You could put down the greatest stand of a sod cover that looks like a golf course, but you're going to get encroachment over time. And that's just a natural weed shift. And you'll want to renovate that possibly. How long that's going to be really depends on the location and whatever the goal is. But I think that whole, for eternity no-till is not reasonable. It might be every few years. It might be, alternate row, but just keeping that in mind.
So I like harnessing the power of all of the little invertebrates that live in the soil, particularly earthworms, can be pretty efficient at moving compost and other things into the soil if you put it on in the fall as the moisture's arriving from rain. And that's pretty much how we've done a lot of it in Mendocino County. And when we put compost on, it's not huge amounts. It's usually 1 to 2 tons per acre, maybe mixed with limestone. And it's pretty effective at kind of going into the soil in most cases if we have a normal growing season. If we do have to do tillage, I'd like us to start focusing a little bit on approaches that have been used in the Midwest to go to minimal till, which involves using cultivators rather than discs, where we're kind of slicing the soil and popping it up and cutting off the weed roots, and then maybe following later on to press the soil back down a little bit to make it smoother so that you can walk in the vineyard without it being really a mess. But inverting the soil with the disc is probably not the best thing for maintaining aggregate stability and the overall health of the vineyard. So, we want to kind of minimize that kind of really extreme tillage if we possibly can.
I agree with your earthworm comment. There is a great mechanism. If you look at forest soils and you look at our beautiful prairie soils, those topsoils were developed without any tillage. The organic matter hits the surface, it gets worked into the soil, and the topsoil develops and it gets deeper as this organic matter keeps being put into the system. The time to put in the soil amendments and these things is pre-plant. If you can't do that, you're going to renew your cover crop, as we talked about it. There's going to be a point where you're going to have to go in and do some disking or do some tillage. That's probably an optimal time to do that.
Excellent. Hold on to the mic. You're up next.
All right, fair enough.
And this is definitely building on that same question, or what you were just talking about, is that a lot of growers who have managed with no-till observe a reduction or crash in vigor after 4 to 7 years. What do you think are the main reasons this is happening, and what are your suggestions to avoid or manage for this with the least amount of tillage necessary?
Well, it's competition from the cover crops. The cover crops basically are planted weeds, and our grapevines can get stressed by them, particularly with shallow root zones. The cover crops will dry that alleyway out and consume a lot of nutrients. I think it's a both nutrient and water competition issue. To deal with that initially, when a young vineyard's getting established, you might want to go to a every other row till system where you're going to incorporate the cover crops to allow that vineyard to get some good root development and get strong enough in order to tolerate that cover crop competition. I think another issue is rootstock selection. There isn't enough vigor in the rootstock to be able to tolerate that competition. And so you're going to have to put more water and nutrients on to prop it up. But I think with correct vineyard design and maybe not going to full cover initially, but letting it get established, it might help mitigate that. And like anything with growing any type of crop, just add fertilizer and water and and the bigger issue should address themselves.
So it's always site specific to me. So I have a vineyard, 1 acre of Arnace, which is an Italian variety that is just blissfully happy. And the last time I tilled the soil was 1996. I have a nice kind of mosaic of subterranean clovers and burmetic and wild oats and blando brome. So whatever shows up to the party is what grows, and it changes from year to year because it depends upon how much nitrogen the clovers produced the year before. So we kind of go back and forth, back and forth. So that's probably an unusual situation. It's on beautiful soil. It's on Yocheo sandy loam and Russian River loam. But on the other hand, I've seen in Oregon, Patty showed me vineyards that were growing wonderfully under sod culture of fine fescues, which seem to be beautifully adapted to those sites. And then there's other times where I've seen vigor sucked down in 2 seasons from no tilling. So you really kind of have to do an assessment. There's no rules, there's no formula other than look at the vines. I mean, in the end, that's what the purpose of all this is, not to get literally lost in the weeds down on the vineyard floors. Take a look at the vines. The vines will tell you whether you're on the right track or not, and be prepared to change it because it isn't forever necessarily. So it's really up to the wine grower to kind of make the decisions about whether they've got enough or not enough vigor. And And certainly alternating with some tillage is something you can do if you don't have enough vigor.
I think a big way to see if the vines are going to crash is certainly taking a look at the nitrogen. And like we saw pretty much within the first 3 years, we were affecting nitrogen levels, and not just in the plant itself, but in the fruit. And so the fruit it took took about the same amount of time to change the yans. So, you know, if you're seeing no-till and you have low yans, I think the winemakers will probably want to see yan going up. And if you've got ability to irrigate, drip irrigation, put some, N fertilizer on, it could be pretty effectively boosted. And if you don't have that ability, we've even had some growers put on foliar nitrogen onto the canopies late season to boost yan, so that you can still maintain a no-till system and work around it with some nitrogen inputs.
I guess I'm good. So excellent points. When you're last, you have to say excellent points for everybody. And they were. I mean it. First of all, I want to mention, if everybody doesn't know, that Glen Mcgorry literally wrote the book on cover cropping in vineyards. And it's a book I use a lot for cover crop selections, and it's all marked up, and it's an excellent resource for me, and it will be for years to come. Thanks, Glenn. I think to answer your question as best I can, that hasn't been said already. I think compaction tends to be a big issue with no-till, and it's because you're not, obviously you're not being able to loosen that soil that's been under the wheel tracks for years and years. So it's really important that if you're doing no-till, that you, that's why alternate till is so commonly used, but at least part of the reason. But if you're doing that, you do have a propensity to compact soil without the ability to fluff it back up. And I think the compaction in the wheel track does tend to cause problems with the vines and competition with the vines directly, just because of the lack of aeration. Could be channeling water. There are lots of reasons. So I think it's important if you're going no-till to be as light on the soil. And it's true for any system. You should be as light on the soil as you can. Early spring, we have a hard time here because we're always getting a lot of rain. Maybe it's not this year, but in a normal spring, we're getting rain in the spring here in the North Coast, and keeping lighter equipment in the vineyard to do your herbicide spraying, which most people do now, but even on the first few passes of fungicide sprays, to keep those with light equipment as much as possible to reduce the compaction will help. It's also cover crop selection, but like I said, Glen's the authority there, but I think the tendency years ago, at least decades ago, was to use some of the really, really heavy native perennial grasses for cover crops in no-till systems, and it really did devigorate, and I think we've gone away from that in many situations.
Okay, Kate, how many questions do we have? No, how many are there? Oh, there's two. All right, then I'm going to ask another question here before we get to the group questions. If you're using an alternate row management, what do you think is the optimal interval to switch the rows? Because I've seen everything from yearly to 5 years to the life of that particular vineyard till it's replanted. What do folks here think is a good interval? Patty, you want to go first since you got the mic?
Sure. So mostly in Oregon, they have no interval. It's basically the permanent alley is left there for a long time. And in part because they don't want to mess with it, because when we've got that tilled part, it's mushy for a lot of the season, and you just need to have something for traction. But I usually recommend that it's when you start seeing that you have a reduction in the growth, in part because where you get the wheel wells, there tends to be a lack of growth there, and your cover crop can kind of get a little bit narrower, or you see weed shifts come in and there starts to be some perennial weed issues, and then just renovating it so it's a better stand. And that's when we would recommend flipping the sides. I think what would be nice seems like 3 years, that if you flip flop every 3 years would make a good sense over time. But that's given the situation we have in Oregon. Right. So, but that's not what necessarily people are doing. I think it would potentially be better.
All right, why don't you pass it down to Glenn?
So it kind of depends on how much you like sitting on your tractor and how much you want to spend on cover crop seed. So the more expensive the seed, the more longer I want to keep it there. So if we're going to a perennial system, like for instance with the hard fescues, there's not a lot of that done in our region, but there's a little bit. It's expensive to seed that, so we're going to hold on to that probably for 3 to 5 years. If the seed is less expensive, then we may switch more often. But the standard seems to be about 3 years. Seems to be kind of what a lot of the growers like to do, is a 3-year program.
I agree with that, and I think Patty's point about when it starts to get weedy, starts to ask to be changed. I think that's a good. But once you start getting to about 3 to 5 years, the weeds start to, invasive weeds start to come in. You can renew that, clean it up, and then go the other row.
Great.
One other thing I wanted to add is if you have a severe gopher problem, you may want to be tilling more often,
Yeah.
because things start to get lumpy, and then where the gopher holes are, you start to get noxious weeds blowing in and seeding and that. So that might be another reason why you would change the frequency of discing. And I don't see that so much in our area, but my family has property down in San Luis Obispo County, and the gophers seem to be taking over the world down there. So we actually went to full tillage to try to discourage them, and then went on a very aggressive gopher control program.
And
We found that, this is a little bit of an aside since you brought it up, we found that spading, if you're tilling, is a good option to kill gophers. It really chops them in half, or chops them enough that they don't want to. Here you go.
And
It did fix some big problems we had. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think 3 to 5 years would be my answer as well. Typically, the 3 years, we just don't see growers being able to stretch it that far, because we do start getting the nastier weeds. But 5 years would be great if we could do it.
Great. I have, they've relayed some questions to me here, so I will ask you, these are coming from the audience. Based on field experience, is there a relationship between soil health and pest and or disease issues in the vineyard? Brian, why don't you start us off?
Magic wand here. I think when grapevines are under nutrient stress or water stress, they are prone to be more impacted by diseases and pests. I don't know there's been any work that concisely measured that, but in general, when you have a good healthy topsoil and you have good healthy plants, and they do tend to fend off diseases and pests and gophers and all of that much easier. So I think there's some anecdotal evidence, but I don't know that I've seen anything research-wise that bears that out.
So I had some very interesting experiences with AXR1 and Phylloxera B in studies I did with Jeff Granett and also both in California and Australia. And it was really clear that when we increased organic matter in soils and in our organic vineyards in Mendocino County, they lasted quite a bit longer, because what it didn't eliminate Phylloxera. Those vineyards eventually needed to be replaced. But what kills the roots basically is that the Phylloxera creates wounds that things like Fusarium get into, and Rhizoctonia and other soil-borne diseases. And by having more biological activity as a result of the organic matter, it decreased the severity of the damage. And we found that in Mendocino County, we had a lot of organic vineyards on AXR1 rootstock that are still around, and they had damage as early as 1992. They're all having to be replaced because eventually they'll get to sub-economic performance because of the Phylloxera. But it certainly gave the growers a lot of time to plan and to change things. So I think that there probably is more competition when you only have a pathogen and grapefruits. That's what the pathogen's going to do, is eat the grapefruit. And when you have some competition with other bacteria that might eat the pathogen and fungi, then you might see some improvement in the overall performance of the vines.
We've seen similar cases in Oregon where we have vines that have Phylloxera on own roots that are 40 plus years old, and they're still doing fine. I mean, they're starting to decline with recent stressors, but we believe that the reason we don't succumb as quickly is because we have plenty of soil moisture, plenty of nutrition, and usually that's where we're managing the vineyard floors so that they're encouraging vigor. In addition to phylloxera, I think there's also the question of nematodes. Can we also, for this, with the same respect to nematodes, improve vine health so that they're not succumbing to nematodes? We also see that many of our vines have trunk disease, and we don't really know it until we start cutting into them. Why we aren't seeing them succumb, we think, is also, again, because we've got healthy soil environment, plenty of plant vigor, and they're able to deal with that. So managing vigor, essentially, and vine health through the soil is, I think, helping keep some of those problems at bay. Even though we've still got them, it's just able to maintain the life of a vineyard. So
I think just to add, but maybe it's not even adding, maybe paraphrasing what you're saying, what y'all are saying, is that an unhealthy soil will impact the pathogens just as much as it will impact the beneficials. But a healthy soil will allow the vine root system to be strong enough and the vine itself to be strong enough to grow and thrive despite the presence of these pathogens. I think that's kind of the way I think about it. We're not really supplanting with a healthy soil. We're not necessarily getting rid of the good. We're not necessarily supporting the bad guys over the good guys. They're all gonna be healthy and happy. And so we have a lot of really good soils that have a lot of nematodes or phylloxera, but our vines are able to withstand if we get the right rootstock, and we have a strong vine in general.
Great. We have time for one or two more questions. Two more questions we're going to do. Can the panel discuss any experience they have with crimping cover crops in a no-till environment? Mark, why don't you go first?
I'll go first, but I don't have any experience with it.
Easy.
I know people who've done it, and I've also heard anecdotally, and that's why I won't really talk about it, that it wasn't very effective. I prefer just mowing, and I think mowing is a good option.
So I don't have any direct experience, but there's a couple growers in the Willamette Valley that have used crimping. And what they've told me is that timing is essential. And depending on what cover crop is in there and knowing the timing relative to the soil moisture, and some of that's playing a crystal ball. You don't know what's going to happen. So that's the hardest thing. And I don't have answers for it, but that's basically what I've heard from practitioners.
So I have some experience with it and watching growers use it, and it does work. It works particularly if you're using big, fat, fluffy annual cover crops and you really crunch them down pretty good. My concern is that you leave a lot of organic matter on the surface, which I kind of like, but given the severity of fires that we've had in the last few years, it's really clear that you put your vineyard at risk by leaving a lot of organic matter on the soil. So that's why I'm more inclined to like the sheep to come in and clean everything up, because what we see in a lot of the fires that have happened in wine country is that the fire will hit the vineyard and maybe burn a little bit into the vineyard, but if everything is really mowed down very, very short, there's not much fuel, and we don't get a lot of damage into the vineyard. So that's something that I have concerns about, and that's why I like the idea of having mulches in the vineyard, but if it's in an area that's prone to fire, then you really have to think about whether that's a smart way to go.
I agree. I do like the idea of mulches. I like the idea that if it's not chopped up as much, you're going to have maybe hold a little more soil moisture, but you're also growing an instrument that's striking the soil, and you can have a little more soil compaction, and soil compaction is certainly an important thing to consider. The fire factor is a huge one. Now, I guess no surprise, that's on everyone's mind.
Right. Maybe less in the Willamette Valley. So the last question is a very interesting one, which is, we've been talking about cover crops, we've been talking about reducing tillage, and we've been talking about using compost. Which one do you think might have the most impact, or are they all equal? Brian, take it away. You got the mic.
Okay. Question being compost, cover crops, or
no-till. What maybe has the greatest potential to increase soil health, or is that just too hard a question?
Well, it's not too hard of a question. I think you're going at the same thing from different directions, basically. So, anytime you've got that root system in the soil where you're rather than just putting your cover crop's going to put that root system in there, and you're going to end up with a crumb soil texture or structure more than you do a subangular blocky. So that's going to create more pore spaces and do a lot of good things for all the living faction of the soil. So I like having a root system down in there, but putting compost in and planting something is going to get you there too. So if you're using both a good compost and a green manure or a permanent planting, you know, I think it's just 3 different ways to get there. If I had to pick one, I want that root system because I want the aggregate stability. I don't want to lose the topsoil I have, and I want that crumb soil structure in that topsoil.
Cover crops by far, and you know, because I'm going to think about it differently, which we rarely do in agriculture, is kilocalories in versus kilocalories out. So producing compost is pretty energy intensive by the time that you turn the compost and gather the materials and bring them into your vineyard and till it in. So if we think about no-till seeding with a cover crop, we can add a lot of organic matter to the soil with a pretty minimal disturbance, and more importantly, with way less energy. I had some really positive experiences early working with cover crops with slit seeders, which basically slice through the surface of the soil, drop seed down, and then compact it a little bit, just tamp it in on the way out. And it works really well on the North Coast. It's a really good way to seed annual covers. So when we think about what's the least amount of energy to get the most benefit, it's probably that approach. If we're not going to think about energy, I want all 3. I mean, I'm not going to skimp on it if we really need to do soil improvement. It may not be necessary forever, but at least initially when you're starting.
I'm not sure I have much more to add other than, you know, from a perspective of what we don't know about every possible combination or individual plant selection, you know, I think that's when it comes into which one do we want, but which one can we practically do becomes a big question. You know, we've talked about different things like undervine cover crops. You know, I've toyed with just how to design a study, and I think, okay, we could grow just about anything in our soils in Oregon, but can we get what we want to grow? And I think it becomes some of those practical questions about how do we get what we want out of what we're doing. And then another perspective is sometimes in viticulture, we want to feel like we're doing something to move the dial. And sometimes the dial is going to move with or without us. And so sometimes taking an approach of let's do something, but let's not be micromanagers, I think is sometimes a good way of looking at it. That because I feel like a no-till is something where you set things up really well for what you want to do, but then you step back and let it do its thing and interject when you need to. And so having it takes a little bit of a paradigm shift for some, especially premium wine growers that feel like they have to do something all the time. And sometimes it's like, well, make a good plan and then stick with it, but hold back.
Same with wine. Mark, take us home.
Take you home. So I was just thinking as they were talking, I was listening too, multitasking. Anyway, an acre-foot slice of soil weighs nominally about 4 million pounds. 1% of that's 40,000 pounds. Did I figure that right? I think I did. That's a lot of organic matter to try to raise a percentage, 1%. So my answer to your question, the best I can, is I agree with Glenn that cover crops are going to give you more biomass, so more likely more carbon per acre than a compost application. Regardless of how much it costs to make it, it's still, you put compost on, you're also bringing other things with it, mostly nitrogen, which namely nitrogen, which could be really bad for a high quality vineyard. So yeah, so cover crops are the best way to input nitrogen, in my opinion. The best way to leave it there is no-till. So it's a two-way answer, I guess. And I think, no-till is definitely, as Josh talked about, and Patty did too, I think it's the best way to preserve soil organic matter.
Excellent. Well, those are all excellent remarks, and we have passed our time, I believe. So this has been great. Thank you. If anyone has any burning parting comments, but I kind of feel like that last round really kind of covered a summary of your thinking. That was great. Thank you all. Thank you to everyone who participated on the webinar and stuck in there with us and adjusted to the current situation. And we got to continue on and have a great webinar and address the subject. So there will be more, and keep an eye on both the wine growers and the RCD website for upcoming events and more opportunities to learn about this and implement practices. And that's it. Thank you.